Just the other day, we looked at the new RTX 5050 from NVIDIA, a card that was set to truly try and bring the latest generation of graphics performance to the more budget-friendly mainstream end of the market. Sadly, from our own testing and looking at the performance, that just wasn't the case, unless you were potentially relying on upscaling through the latest DLSS technology with multi-frame generation. Now, one big question that we had, which was clear from the comments, was why we didn't test the RTX 3050. So here we are today, taking a look at the RTX 3050 versus the RTX 5050 in 30 games to see what kind of generational uplift improvements we're actually seeing in rasterization-based games, as well as ray tracing-based titles. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
This sucks. I wish I had an upgrade.
You have summoned the gaming genie.
What is your wish? Better gear? For an upgrade?
Your wish is my command. Zone Elite XL Matte, smooth, comfortable, spill resistant, and the sleek Zone Matte for precision gaming. NZXT Function Elite Mini TKL, magnetic switches, compact and precise. Featuring per key adjustable actuation with 40 points of sensitivity ranging from 0.6mm to 4mm to fit your individual needs. Lift Elite wireless mouse, lightweight, responsive, and ultra fast. Capsule Elite mic, pro quality audio, crystal clear, every game chat will be flawless. Genie approved upgrades. Make your gaming wishes come true with NZXT. Find out more by clicking the link in the description below. Now, I want to start off by saying a quick caveat. The reason we didn't test the RTX 3050 in our initial launch day coverage was purely down to the time frame that we had. We ended up receiving a card from Colourful and ended up being on a pretty tight timeline and schedule to try and get things tested and published. So for the most part, we did compare the RTX 5050 to the likes of the RX 7600 XT and 9060 XT from AMD due to their somewhat similar pricing. And then older NVIDIA-based cards from previous generations like the RTX 4060 and RTX 3060 Ti. However, now that we've kind of got a little bit more time, we want to take, I guess, a bit of a deeper dive into what is arguably the evolutionary step up. So today it's all about the RTX 3050 versus the RTX 5050. Now, much to NVIDIA's disappointment, I'm sure, we won't be looking at multi-frame generation of any form or any other form of upscaling technology, but instead we'll be focusing purely on rasterization and ray tracing based performance in 30 games at 3 different resolutions, which is, I guess, going against the grain of what they'd like to see. While we have no illusion that NVIDIA wants us to talk about multi-frame generation and upscaling based technology, that's going to be something for a separate feature, which we will be looking at shortly, so make sure you check that out once it's published. Today, however, as I mentioned, is all about pure rasterization performance and ray tracing, because I think it's safe to say that this is what the general consumer and gamer out there wants to see, based on comparing like for like or apples to apples in terms of moving from one graphics card, maybe a 30 series or a 40 series NVIDIA-based GPU, all the way up to the latest RTX 5050. So what is going to be interesting today is how the RTX 5050 stacks up against the RTX 3050, considering that they both pack 8GB of GDDR6 on a 128-bit memory interface. And, well, spec-wise, they come in identically in all areas barring the amount of L2 cache and the memory bandwidth. And that, I think, will actually lead to a lot of consumers potentially brandishing this card, like they did with the 3050, that it should, well, have ever really been called an RTX card in the first place, because the 3050 wasn't exactly setting the world alight in ray tracing. But I guess we're at a different time now and things have improved quite a bit since the early 2022 launch. So 3050 aside, there's definitely some other key comparisons I'd like to look at in the future, including the Intel B580, which sadly we don't have one on hand, but we are working to source one so that we can make more content as to how that actually compares, especially given the myriad of differences between that particular GPU from Intel and, well, this latest offering from NVIDIA. There's also, as mentioned, the 9060 XT 8GB. Again, while we haven't tested that ourselves, it's pretty clear from the outlets that have had that card on hand that, well, it's just not worth going for. And instead, you should pay the extra $50 to get the 16GB variant instead. But it does make for an interesting comparison to the 5050. And again, this is something that we'll look to do in the future. So let us know if that's something you want to see. Now, one thing is clear that, well, it's a big sticking point, is that 8GB of VRAM in 2025 just isn't feasible anymore, especially when you look at games like Doom Eternal, where you can quite easily run out of 8GB of memory when raising the settings or the resolution, or a combination of the two. And then the likes of games such as Indiana Jones, where it simply doesn't even run at 1080p on the highest settings due to VRAM limitations. So the big one comes down to, well, these two cards that we have today. And, well, the fact that the RTX 3050 and the RTX 5050 both launched for $249. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how things stack up. So what we've done is we've thrown both GPUs into a huge selection of games at 3 resolutions. Though I will warn you, because of where these cards are aimed at performance-wise and their relative pricing, 4K is essentially going to be out of reach without any form of upscaling. But, well, this is something that we will look at in a later feature, including that all-important multi-frame generation technology. Now, to test these cards, we put both of them onto our GPU test bench, consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte Aorus B650E master motherboard. All of our testing was done on the latest version of Windows 11 with all the latest updates, and we used the latest NVIDIA 576.88 driver. As mentioned, we will be focusing mainly on 1080p today because that is essentially where these cards are aimed at, but we do have the data for other resolutions as well, as us looking at percentage differences for all the games tested. But if you do want to see the individual data for every single game that we've run, you can do so over on our Patreon, where you'll also get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. So, with that all out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where at 1080p we see a pretty sizable improvement of 59% from the 3050 up to the 5050, which is now enough to give us an average that sits above 60 FPS, albeit not at a very stable frame rate, as we do see dips down to 49 frames per second. This increase is pretty impressive in isolation, but really it's what I would have hoped for from the 3050 all along, since it is only 1080p that we're talking about. 1440p and 4K don't prove to be any better, with only 4% and 13% gains respectively, which only amount to 1 and 2 FPS at those resolutions, which, well, in all honesty, is pretty dire. Next up is Alan Wake 2, and here we see another pretty decent jump at 1080p with 50% more performance, but this isn't quite enough to get us over that magic 60 FPS mark, although with some adjustment to settings this should actually be pretty easy to achieve. 1440p sees a much better result this time around, with another 50% improvement in frame rates, now setting us above 30 FPS, which is at least playable. Whereas 4K, it does see a bigger jump, but not by all that much. Whilst a 45% gain sounds, well, pretty impressive, it does only work out to be 5 FPS in real-world performance, which is fine since, well, I guess this isn't a 4K card anyway. Our next game is Baldur's Gate 3, and here we see the 5050 take our frame rates from playable but not amazing on the 3050 to perfectly acceptable, with a 64% increase in the averages. And, well, that means we see a pretty hefty jump to over 80 frames per second, with lows also now sitting above 60 FPS. Looking at 1440p, we can see that the performance is also now at a much more playable level, with a 62% jump in performance now hitting that 60 FPS threshold, meaning this is the first game that you can play comfortably at 1440p if you wanted to on this card. 4K is less impressive, as you'd expect, though we do still see 50% faster performance, but again, this is inflated by lower numbers, as we only actually see an improvement of 11 FPS, which is just about enough to get us over the 30 FPS mark. In Black Myth Wukong, we can see another set of pretty impressive jumps, this time at all resolutions, with an improvement of 75% at 1080p, 65% at 1440, and 70% at 4K. At the lower resolutions, it does manage to take that game from barely playable to somewhat playable, with 1440p actually being the nicest improvement in terms of playability, since 30 FPS is at least manageable. Of course, 60 FPS is ideal, but that also seems to be a bit of an unrealistic standard for this title, and on this caliber of cards. Meanwhile, 4K did technically improve on performance, but sitting well under 30 is nothing amazing, but also not expected at this price point. Our next game, Counter-Strike 2, is an interesting one since the performance was always more than playable here, even at 4K, but hardcore fans of this game will always look to push frame rates as high as possible. And in that sense, this is quite the upgrade, with 1080 seeing improvements of 58%, now bringing performance over the 400 FPS mark, which is more than enough to take advantage of a 300Hz monitor. Speaking of a 300Hz monitor, 1440p also sees a pretty hefty improvement, sitting just below 300 FPS with a 55% improvement over the RTX 3050. But with only 150 FPS in the lows, it does leave something to be desired, as you'd really, well, see those dips at those crucial moments and, well, feel them overall. Finally, for this game is 4K, and here we can see our smallest improvement with 51% more performance, but with a much closer 1% low frame rate, which would actually feel smoother than 1440p would with the huge dips that you'd experience there. Next up is Cyberpunk, and here we can see what would actually be our biggest increase so far, with 1080p seeing a generational uplift of 110%, more than doubling the 3050's performance. Obviously, this isn't something that we should come to expect for performance increases across generations, but it's good to see nonetheless. 1440p sees a much less dramatic improvement with only a 60% uplift, though this is enough to make the averages and lows pretty much meet the 1080p performance of the 3050. So at least, well, that's something. Then at 4K, we see a pretty strong 63% jump in frame rates, and while it sounds like a lot, it is worth remembering that these lower frame rates do inflate the percentages, and we only actually see a 7 FPS bump here, which, well, isn't enough to make this game playable, though with multi-frame generation support in this title, you can at least leverage that if you really wanted to. F124 is next in the list, and here we see some less impressive jumps across all three resolutions. 1080p sees us gaining only 24% more performance, and whilst it is an improvement, it's, well, nothing amazing. 1440p does see a bigger jump with a 49% boost to frame rates, while 4K sees a 48% jump, taking both the average and the 1% low frame rates above 60 FPS, making this game more than playable at all three resolutions, which is a nice improvement, and if this is the only game that you're looking to play, well, then you're set. The 3050 in Hogwarts Legacy was what I would consider unplayable at 1080p, however with a 57% boost to frame rates to the 5050, we now see an average of over 60 frames per second. Though I would have liked to have seen maybe slightly higher low figures, though with upscaling and frame gen technology, this could actually be even better. 1440p is another example of performance not being quite what we'd hoped for, but the 42% jump in performance is enough to get the 5050's frame rates to beat the 3050's 1080p performance yet again, but not enough to make a meaningful difference here anyway. Then 4K sees a similar jump in performance with 43% more performance than we saw from the 3050, but this isn't just enough to make the game, well, what I would consider playable, since with average frame rates lower than 30, you're not looking at a particularly fun time unless you're using upscaling, which is seemingly the point of this card, especially in this title. Starfield is next, and here we see some pretty lackluster boost in performance from the new 5050. We do see a 50% improvement at 1080p, 52% at 1440, and 50% at 4K, which doesn't sound too bad when you put it like that. But what makes this disappointing is that we don't see any resolution hitting over 60 frames per second, not even from 1080p. And as a side note, 4K couldn't even break 30 FPS. So for this title, you're definitely going to be needing some upscaling tech, as, well, this is overall pretty disappointing. Yes, it does come close to breaking the 60 FPS and 30 FPS mark in places, but you do, I guess, still need to consider the lows, that dip that, well, go even further, and that will just generally make for a less smooth feeling gameplay experience overall. Our final rasterization game is War Thunder, and this is a title that already saw some pretty large frame rates, and with a 46% boost in frame rates at 1080p, we now see the 5050 managing to break 300 frames per second, with almost 100 FPS more on average. 1440p also sees a decently impressive jump with frame rates up by 45%, taking us from 142 to 206 FPS. And with lows of 161, it means that if you had a 144 or 160Hz monitor, then this will feel particularly smooth all of the time. Then finally, at 4K, we see a jump of 42%, and whilst this is only equivalent to 31 FPS in the averages, it is enough to see our lows break the 60 FPS mark, whereas on the 3050, didn't quite manage that before. So now you can, I guess, happily play this game, even at 4K, on this tier of card. Now, those more keen-eyed of you may have noticed that we actually skipped Indiana Jones here, and, well, for a good reason. It just didn't run, like, at all, as the 8GB of VRAM just wasn't enough for this game, and, well, once we got to the main menu, the game would simply close with a hard crash, no matter what. We did try a few things to rectify this, of course, such as sticking a much more powerful card in our system to lower the settings and the resolution to something that, well, these cards should have been able to handle. But even then, nope, nothing. The only real solution would have been to adjust even more settings from within an INI file, but at that point, it's just not something a casual gamer would be willing to, or, well, even able to do for a game that they just spent $50 on. And whilst it's easy for me to point at the 8GB of VRAM and blame that for the issue, it's worth remembering that the developers also have a responsibility to make games playable on all sorts of hardware. So I guess I can see both sides of the argument here. But that to one side, what about ray tracing? As, well, these are RTX cards. Well, to find out, we ran a few games with it enabled. Here we find in Alan Wake 2 that ray tracing performance has seen a pretty impressive boost in performance. 1080p sees us jump up by 69%, now managing to break that all-important 60 frame per second boundary, with our average frame rate sitting just above it at 61 FPS. But we do still see our 1% low results sitting below this point at 52. So whilst you can expect dips, it isn't too bad overall. 1440p also makes the game more playable, but not quite as smooth, with another boost of 69%, breaking the 30 FPS point in both the averages and the lows, making it a playable but not amazing experience. But it is enough to at least enjoy the game. 4K sees us going from utterly unplayable to only mildly unplayable, with our biggest improvement so far of 500%. But since the 3050 only managed 3 FPS in its averages last time, this is nothing all that exciting, as the 18 FPS that we see from the 5050 is still pretty dire. Also worth mentioning here is that we ran all these tests with upscaling enabled and set to balanced, as well, without it, this game is almost completely unplayable, even with higher tier cards. So part of the improvements that we see here are also the improvements to the upscaling tech on the newer card. Black Myth is up again, and it's worth noting that from here on out, our ray trace results don't feature upscaling, so this is pure performance that we're looking at. And at 1080p, we can see a pretty impressive jump with 100% more performance than we saw on the RTX 3050, doubling the frame rate. But as impressive as that sounds, we are yet again let down by what this translates to in real-world performance, as this isn't even enough to break 30 FPS. 1440p also sees a significant jump, this time of 112% or 9 FPS, but again in the real world this means very little, as we only see an average of 17 frames per second, making this again pretty unplayable, especially for a game that requires such tight timing from your actions. Then at 4K, the performance is predictably awful, with a 50% boost in performance that only equates to 2 frames per second, which means that we go from 4 FPS to 6. So without upscaling, you can't really expect to get anything out of these cards, and even then I doubt you'd want to push it to 4K anyway. Cyberpunk is up next, and what we find is even worse than what we saw from Black Myth, with 1080 and 1440p both only seeing improvements of 3 FPS, which equates to 23% and 43% respectively, but not enough to make either resolution playable, as the highest we see is 16 FPS from 1080p, and even then we are actually seeing our low figures drop by a single frame, so yeah, there is that. Then at 4K, why even bother, as going from 1 FPS to 2 is pretty much nothing, even if it is technically double the frame rate. On a slightly more positive note, we have F124, where at 1080p we see frame rate jumps up above 60 FPS with a 52% improvement over the 3050, so you could genuinely play the game quite happily like this if you wanted to. Even at 1440p, we see playable frame rates of 40 FPS, which is an improvement of 90% over the RTX 3050, though obviously this is, well, still not great, but at least it's now playable. 4K sees a 50% improvement, taking us from 6 FPS to 9, again putting it still completely out of reach on both cards, so why even bother? Then finally, for ray tracing, we have Hogwarts Legacy with a pretty impressive start at 1080p, with our frame rate seeing a performance boost of 187%. Taking things from 23 FPS all the way up to 66, with lows barely below 60, making this, well, more than playable. And this is the kind of thing that I wish we saw from this head-to-head. Then, at 1440p, it comes along to ruin the mood by actually being the first and only time we've seen the average frame rate of the 5050 sitting lower than the 3050, albeit only by a single frame per second. And with margin of error and how low this performance is, I'd be more inclined to consider this the, well, same level of performance, as 1 FPS won't make any meaningful difference to how playable the game is anyway, especially when you're only sitting at around 10 FPS anyway. Last up is 4K, and once again there isn't really much to say here, as this card isn't designed to be used at this resolution, so we shouldn't be surprised that the results are terrible, with only 3 FPS on average and 2 FPS in the lows, that, well, even with the most extreme levels of upscaling, there's not really, I guess, any saving it. So with 15 games under our belt, it's pretty much what was expected. Some good, solid gains in areas, with 1080p being the big one that at least means we can now play a lot of games at playable frame rates, whereas on the RTX 3050, this was generally out of reach for the most part. Now, speaking of being out of reach, both of these cards were never aimed at higher resolutions, though it was actually nice to see that in some titles, the RTX 5050 was at least, I guess, playable in places, even at 1440p. And I guess one thing that can be said is that the higher resolution could be even more within reach if you're able to leverage upscaling, of which I guess the latest Blackwell card does have better and improved technology in that area. Now, to get a better picture as to how things sit across a bigger selection of games, it is worth taking a look at the percentage differences. And for the sake of being transparent and looking at where these cards sit, we're only actually going to be going through the 1080p data because, well, the higher resolutions may actually show larger gains, but that is, for the most part, artificially inflated due to the lower figures in the first place, especially given that the RTX 3050, on occasion, was sitting in single digits. It's here we find 57% faster performance moving from the RTX 3050 up to the RTX 5050. There are some strong sizable gains, more so in ray tracing based titles including Hogwarts Legacy at 187% and Black Myth Wukong at 100%, but other non-ray trace titles are also thrown into the mix, like Cyberpunk without RT enabled at 110%, and Black Myth Wukong again, this time without RT, at 76%. The majority of the games did see strong uplifts of 47% or higher, leading to the overall 57% figure, while other titles saw lower improvements like Doom Eternal at just 7%, but as we mentioned, VRAM is a really important aspect in this game. As we look at the 1% lows, the RTX 5050 comes in with 63% faster performance overall, again with some games leading to that number being much higher, like Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled at 307%, while the rest of the titles sit at 123% or lower, with Counter-Strike 2 leading the way. What's interesting here is how Cyberpunk with RT enabled actually favours the RTX 3050 with a variance of 11%, but this is just a single FPS and retesting garnered the same result. And, well, really isn't a talking point at all, as we're talking, well, a single digit number either way anyway. This has definitely shown that NVIDIA have come in with strong uplifts over the RTX 3050 in both the averages and the lows, and this again has put titles that were, I guess, once unplayable now in the realm of being playable, and even at levels you could class as, I guess, enjoyable. So performance looks strong. I don't think anyone would complain about the numbers that we saw today, though there is a caveat to all of this, and something I'll talk about shortly. But first, it's worth taking a look at power, where, as we know, generally as we move up a generation or two, we do see more performance, but at a cost of more power. Though what's interesting here is that both cards come in with a TDP of 130 watts, though for the most part the RTX 5050 uses every ounce of that limit, with it consistently hitting 130 watts in a lot of games. The RTX 3050 did have moments where it drew closer and on occasion matched the 130 watts, but in some places we saw it consistently using less power, like in Black Myth Wukong with RT enabled, where it came in at 111 watts on average compared to 127 watts, while other games like Ratchet & Clank with RT enabled came in matched at 105 watts. Now, we're not talking huge differences overall, but if power is an important metric for you, then, well, the newer Blackwell-based card does use more overall. In terms of temperatures, it was a bit of a mixed bag, and for the most part, the RTX 3050 was the hotter of the two cards, with noticeable differences of 6 degrees in A Plague Tale and 8 degrees difference in Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled. Though again, other games saw results matching, like in Dying Light 2 and Spider-Man 2 with RT enabled. Though it is worth saying that both these cards still remained at comfortable levels throughout all of our tests, with the lowest result coming by the way of the RTX 5050 in Doom Eternal with RT enabled, and our highest being the RTX 3050, again in A Plague Tale. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, yes, the RTX 5050 does see some sizable gains in some titles, and the clearer aspect is how much better improved the ray tracing performance is. Though that comes, I guess, with its own issue, as while the RTX 5050 is better, it's worth noting that the RTX 3050 was frankly terrible. Not just at launch, but even now. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that that helps to buff the numbers up for the new Blackwell-based GPU. Now, one thing that is probably the key point of the RTX 5050 is, well, what it's been able to do in terms of taking levels of performance that in the latest titles were simply beyond reach to now offering a solution that can at least hit the bare minimum levels that a gamer would expect. Remembering that we test games on high or ultra settings, so it does give some consideration about dialing settings in and bringing that performance up even more without sacrificing too much on the visuals. Or as mentioned a few times, bringing upscaling into play. Though I get it that not everyone is sold on that technology just yet. But at least it, I guess, gives you options. Bring things down or inflate them up. And for me, after looking at the 5050 in our launch coverage and then testing it even more, it's definitely starting to paint a better picture as to who and where this card is aimed at. NVIDIA will obviously want to target this at bringing stronger levels of performance for an affordable price. And while the foundation is there, comparatively speaking, I think upscaling with MFG is the big key selling point. Though the big factor here is that, well, not every game supports it. Though that is getting, I guess, much better as time goes on. One big key aspect for me, and it's just a sticking point is the 8 gig of VRAM, which did show its limitations here in a few titles. But I guess to play devil's advocate, if you're not playing those particular titles, then the 5050 may be coming across as a slightly better card than I once thought. But then on the flip side, if you are playing those titles, then you are going to be severely limited. And well, that's something that I think I and gamers just simply won't be able to shake. Yes, at $249, this is the best card that we've tested. Though again, I do want to bring Intel into the mix at some point. But if you can find the extra $100, then I think there are other options on the table that are just so much better. And will give you a card and a level of performance that isn't just for the here and now, but something that will last you a few years until it's time to upgrade. Because in all honesty, do you really want to buy a card now and have to upgrade in less than a year's time, where games get even more demanding and it throws you completely out of the realms of unplayable performance? For me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Let me know what you think. Do you agree with my points, or is the 5050 better than first thought? It's a tricky one, and due to it being at such a finicky price point, I feel like there is an argument that could go either way. That aside, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. Also, if you love what we do and want to see the rest of the charts for all the games, then you can by joining the super special Patreon club. You also get access to a ton of other cool goodies, including behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link for all that good stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.